It takes less than 1 minute to find out if you may have prediabetes. You can do it here. But you probably won't. You're busy. Kids, work, show coming back in 48 seconds. So let's do this now. Hold up one finger if you're a man. Women, 0. 3 more fingers if you're over 60. 2 over 50. 1 over 40. If you're not sure, keep in mind you're sitting on a couch right now. So 1 more finger if you're not very active. 1 finger if yes, 0 if no. 1 yes, 0 no. Next, find the body type that looks most like you and hold up that many fingers while I look around awkwardly. And that's it. If you're holding up 5 fingers or more, you probably have prediabetes. Sorry to be so blunt, but hey, you're busy. Just go to the site.
150 over 90.
180 over 111.
160 over 110. I had a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure looks like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a stroke are far from invisible or silent. If you've come off your treatment plan, get back on it or talk with your doctor to create an exercise, diet, and medication plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
If I would have followed a treatment plan, I would not be in this situation.
Until all our daughters are safe. Until all our children have families. Until all our families have homes. Until all our parents are cared for. We'll be here.
We'll get started. I'm Dr. Kathleen Lewandowski. I'm Director of the School of Social Work at Cleveland State University. So pleased to have all of you here today, and welcome, welcome, welcome. Before we get started and before my opening remarks, I do want to say that there is, if those of you who use Twitter, there is a hashtag for this conference. It's pretty easy. It's hashtag AVB for Ayanna V. Brown. AVBCLE. And so encourage all of you who have Twitter accounts to use that hashtag and tweet out about the conference today. Okay, so on behalf of Cleveland State University and our president, Mr. Harlan Sands, I'm very pleased to welcome all of you, elders, caregivers, professionals, students, community leaders or activists, to the 2019 Anna V. Brown Community Forum and Conference. And I'll just add a caveat that many of you may know that the last time the conference was held was in 2009. So pleased that we were able to bring it back. We'll say more about that. So yes, it has a rich history. Starting in 1987, the Anna V. Brown Community Forum and Conference was this annual event up until 2009 or 2014. I'm not quite sure which it is, but it has been some time. Its revitalization today was possible only because of the dedicated efforts of the members of the Conference Planning Committee, whose names are listed in your program. And I want to personally thank Dr. Victoria Winbush, a member of the School of Social Work faculty, who at my request agreed to serve as the conference coordinator. So Vicki, then thank you so much. I would also like to thank the members of the 2019 Anna V. Brown Conference Planning Committee to stand and to accept our deepest appreciation for your tireless efforts over these past 7 months leading up to today's conference. So if the Conference Planning Committee members who are here could stand. Thank you so much. I was attended and introduced myself to one of the first planning committee meetings at Cleveland State University, and they really are a dedicated group and really did give tireless effort, and you can see the fruits of their work here today. Also, I want to personally thank Mr. Rob Hilton, President and CEO of McGregor Home, and all the members of his staff, particularly Ms. Leanne O'Brien, for so graciously hosting today's conference at this lovely facility. So Leanne, thank you. And all the McGregor staff. In addition, I want to acknowledge the Western Reserve Area Agency on Aging for providing scholarship support for attendees who are over 60 years of age, the Mandel School of Applied Sciences for providing scholarship support for students, the Senior Transportation Program for providing transportation services to enable numerous elders to be in attendance today. Also, the Department of Senior and Adult Services for offering continuing education credits today for licensed social workers, and the Eliza Bryant Center and the City of Cleveland for their marketing leadership and support. And so any representatives of those organizations, if you'd like to stand, and we'll acknowledge you as well. Or they're away. Thank you so much. So I hope that you will today, if you haven't already, take time to visit the resources fair, where there are some over 25 different agencies who wish to provide you with information about their programs and services. In addition, today is our inaugural conference poster presentation, which showcases areas of practice and research of specific topic areas. The creators of the posters are present today and welcome the opportunity to interact with you about their work. And so you can see the posters over there. They're on my left or your right. And so please take a moment to look at those and interact with the poster presenters. And now I will turn the program over to our moderator. Eleanor Hayes is the Director of Communications for the Division of Human Resources at the Cleveland Clinic. Many of you may already know her as the former owner and operator of several McDonald's franchises, and perhaps she's familiar to you as a former TV anchor at Fox 8. We also claim her as part of our family. She earned her Master's of Business Administration at Cleveland State University. Eleanor, thank you for joining us today.
It is indeed my honor to have been invited by Dr. Winbush and the Planning Committee to serve as your moderator today. The theme for the 2019 Anna V. Brown Conference is Connect, Create, and Contribute, reassessing the needs of the Black elderly. The first part of this theme, Connect, Create, and Contribute, may sound familiar to some of you. It's actually the national slogan for this year's Older Americans Month, which, by the way, if you did not already know, is the month we're in right now, May. Older Americans, elders, retirees, seniors, retired citizens, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, godparents, bonus aunts and uncles. By whatever name we call them, they are treasures, and they are vessels filled with knowledge and experiences ready to be poured into the next generations. All we have to do is listen, to listen with our ears and to listen with our hearts. And that is why I am so glad we are coming together again for the Anna V. Brown Community Forum. And I was thinking about it, and I was thinking that community might actually be the fourth C in the theme for this year. It's so very fitting, I think, that I was asked to be a part of today's program. So let me see if I can count the ways. Anna V. Brown was a trustee of Cleveland Clinic. Her father a very well-known physician in West Virginia, and then later in Cleveland, became a distinguished fellow at Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Joseph Brown. And then Anna V. Brown attended Oberlin. I also attended Oberlin. She was there a few years before me, but we were also OBs. Now, okay, so you laugh about that when I say we were a few years apart, but quick story. See, this is what happens when you invite someone who sat in front of the camera a long time and they've been away for a while. They have lots of stories to tell. We were having a family event, and my cousin was introducing us to a new lady friend. And when I told her that I graduated from Shaker Heights High, she looked at me and she said, "So you went to school with Paul Newman?" And I swallowed, and I said, "Well, no, actually, he was a few years ahead of me. But Paul Newman did proudly also attend Shaker Heights High before he went on to Hollywood." She's no longer dating my cousin. Okay. So it is also fitting for me that we are convening here at McGregor today. We've been blessed with longevity in my family on both sides, and next week our family will mark the 7th year since the passing of Clara Smith Jones, my grandmother, who lived here for the last 5 months of her life, who was cared here for the last 5 months of her life until she passed at the age of 102. A thoughtfully religious and outspoken woman, I know that this forum would have been her cup of tea. In many ways, today's conference is an amplification of the slogan, "Connect, Create, and Contribute." This community forum has come to represent an event where elders, caregivers, service providers, students, community leaders, educators can all come together and through their connections create opportunities which serve to contribute to the well-being of individuals, groups, and of the community as a whole. As a way of honoring our elders and our conference founders, and for creating context for today's conference theme of reassessing the needs of Black elders, I'm pleased to have the honor to introduce a video tribute to Anna V. Brown and Dr. Zev Harel. The idea for creating this video grew out of early discussions in the conference planning committee meetings and the dedication and the commitment of 2 of the committee's long-standing members. We're so glad Dr. Edward McKinney and Ms. Samantha Brooks are with us today. Thank you for planting the seed. Mr. Al Nozak from the Cleveland State University Center for Institutional Technology produced the video. Let's watch it now.
I want to welcome you to this conference. And I want you to know that your being here will contribute to the well-being of a people that was often forgotten. And that's why we started this conference. We need to educate the public on the plight of African American age, because we want a world where there's justice and equality for everyone.
At that time, three decades ago, African American elderly were in serious trouble when it came to health issues, housing, economically poor. This is why the conference was such a call to action, to bring together people that would be concerned about those issues confronting the African American population at that time.
Anna V. Brown was born in 1914 and moved to Cleveland in 1941. She began her career in Cleveland working at the Phyllis Wheatley Association. In 1946, she also began managing her father's physician practice, where she became increasingly aware of the issues which faced black elders in Cleveland. In February 1971, Cleveland Mayor Carl B. Stokes appointed her as the executive director of the Commission on Aging. She was frequently invited as a guest lecturer by Dr. Zev Harel, who headed up the Center on Applied Gerontological Studies in CSU's Department of Social Work. She was well known for her advocacy and outspokenness on behalf of elderly citizens.
Zev and Anna were friends, and as such, they dreamed together the importance of this conference. I can remember Anna being on campus lecturing in Zev classes and other classes in social work. She had a respect for Zev and his desire to tell the story, to talk about what people were experiencing as African Americans.
At a very early age in her life, she looked out and thought about people. She was a people person, not just the young people, but the older people as well. And she always wanted to make some kind of influence or effect or a legacy about seniors and what is important for the aging.
She was high energy. She wanted to make a difference.
They started the gerontology program at Cleveland State University. They became very active in the national movement for doing things in response to the needs of the African American elderly. You know, during that time, the White House Conference was going on, and they were delegates to the conference.
So through the friendship of Zev Harel, Anna V. Brown, they gave birth to a conference which would talk about the plight of African American age. And this conference enabled so many persons to be informed, to have information they wouldn't have if it had not been for this conference. And we are talking about students, we're talking about professionals, we're talking about faculty members, we're talking about agency persons, all coming together to be a part of this conference.
Zev Harel was born in 1930 in a small village in Hungary. As a Holocaust survivor, when his camp was liberated in May 1945, he was suffering from typhoid and fell into a ditch where an African-American soldier picked him up and carried him to a nearby hospital. In 1974, he joined Cleveland State University's Department of Social Work, remaining on the faculty until his retirement in 2009. In 1986, Dr. Harel and the faculty in the Department of Social Work initiated the Anna V. Brown Conference as a tribute to the legacy of Anna V. Brown, who had died in 1985.
Dr. Harel was an outstanding chair. He was sensitive to diversity. He understood the necessity to educate the public on persons not a part of the mainstream.
He brought people together to do the planning, and people learned from Dr. Harel. He was very people-oriented, and was always trying to help and assist someone for moving forward, even organizations moving forward. He had that kind of leadership ability to bring people together and set goals and move forward. For the people attending the conference, here is an opportunity to come together and work with each other. You cannot get problems solved working alone or in isolation. People have to come together. They have to come together and they have to set goals measurable objectives in terms of how they are going to get problems solved in the community.
I want to thank Anna Brown for all that she has done for the aging and creating this program to make it work. Her legacy is still continue to go on because it was something that we needed, because we all will be getting old if we live long enough. Thank you, Anna, and may we continue to do this program, what she created and thought of.
Now is the time to come together and to gain valuable knowledge and information, and to recommit to serving the unique needs of the Black elders who reside in the greater Cleveland community.
What a very, very, very nice tribute. What a wonderful salute in video that allows those who wanted to pay homage to Anna V. Brown and Dr. Zev Harel to do it on video so that it lives on. And what a wonderful way for us to acknowledge all of the elders. I'm certainly grateful for the unique lessons that I've learned at the knees of the elders who have been in my life. I would now like to introduce our keynote presenter, Ann W. Wen, PhD. Dr. Wen is an assistant professor at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences at Case Western Reserve University. She's an interdisciplinary scholar focused on research to help explain and address mental and physical health disparities among African American elders. Dr. Wen received her PhD in social work and psychology in 2015 from the University of Michigan. She holds a master's in psychology and a second master's in social work, both from the University of Michigan. In addition to her work on her research grants, she's co-authored numerous articles. One of the most recent is entitled Discrimination, Serious Psychological Distress, and Church-Based Emotional Support Among African American Men Across the Lifespan. Today, Dr. Wen will address reassessing the needs of Black elders. As you think of questions you may want to ask Dr. Wen, please use one of the note cards on your table and jot it down. At the end of her presentation, we hope to have time to present those questions. And now join me in welcoming Dr. Wen.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you. Okay. Well, my hope for today is that we will leave here with a better understanding of the state of Black elders, as well as the needs of Black elders. Okay, okay. All right. I'll just give you a moment to briefly take a look at an overview of my presentation for today before I proceed. Currently, there are 46 million older adults living in the U.S. today, adults aged 65 and older. That equates to 15% of the U.S. population, or 1 in 7 Americans. And the older adult population is expected to be growing rapidly, with projections that by 2030, 1 in 5 Americans will be 65 or older. In fact, projections by the U.S. Census for 2035 projects that older adults will outnumber children. By 2035, it's expected that there will be about 78 million older adults compared to 76 million children. And this number will only increase even further by 2060 with around 95 million older adults to 80 million children. So with the older adult population increasing rapidly, we also see an increase in the racial and ethnic diversity of older adults as well. With the most recent data from the census I have available from 2016, we see that the older adult population currently is 77% white, so about 3/4 white, almost 10% white, almost 10% black, 4% Asian, 8% Latino or Hispanic, and 2% of another race. Now it's projected that by 2050, we will see a decrease in the older white population, with whites decreasing from 77% of the older population to 59% of the older population. We'll see an increase of almost a third of older African Americans by 2050, going from 9% to 12%. Asians will more than double, and Hispanics or Latinos will almost triple. Older adults of other races will increase from 2% to 3%. Now, looking specifically at the racial breakdown of older adults in our county, in Cuyahoga County, we see that the majority of older adults in our county are whites at 73%. This is followed by a good portion of black older adults. Almost a quarter of older adults in our county are black, followed by smaller groups of Asians, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, American Indians, and Alaskan Natives, as well as those who identify as another race group. Now, I'd like for us to focus for the remainder of the presentation specifically on older African Americans. So I'll give you a demographic overview of older African Americans in the U.S. So first, looking at education, we see that with the most recent data from 2016, 75% of older African Americans, that's 3/4 of older African Americans, have a high school degree or equivalency. 18%, that's almost 1 in 5, have a bachelor's degree or higher. And let's compare this data with data from 1998. That's 19 years before 2017. In 1998, we see that less than half of older African Americans have a high school degree or equivalency. And even fewer have a bachelor's degree or higher at 7%. So what this tells us is that the educational attainment of older African Americans have increased tremendously over the years, but we're still not at parity, of course, with the rest of the American population and at parity with other ethnic and racial groups in the U.S. Now, turning to income, looking at the median household income of older adults in the U.S., we see that with the orange bar, all Americans, all older Americans have a median household income of about $5,900. Now compare that to the median household income of older African Americans, which is around $4,400. So there's income disparity here as well. Now, if we were to zoom in and look at specific genders, looking at men, all older American men, we see that there are disparities between all older American men versus older African American men. The same for women. So overall, we see racial disparities in terms of income. And I'm not going to show you data on wealth, but when it comes to wealth disparities, the disparities are even greater. The disparities are extreme between races when it comes to wealth, because wealth can be accumulated across generations, right? Looking at poverty rates, we also see the same pattern. So with poverty rates, African Americans have older African Americans have a poverty rate that is more than twice that of all older Americans. So what we see is that older African Americans, about 20% of older African Americans live in poverty versus 9% of all older Americans. Regarding marital status, a little over a third of older African Americans are married. A little over a quarter are widowed. 19% are divorced. 5% separated. And 13% had never married. Moving on to living arrangements among older African Americans. Living arrangements is important for us to focus on because this has implications for the availability of support. Do you live with somebody who could provide support for you? As well as implications for social isolation. So if we can look at older African American men first, the green bars here, we see that 50%, half of older African American men live with their spouse. 14% live with other relatives. Very few African American men, older African American men, live with non-relatives. And a significant proportion, almost a third, live by themselves. Now, turning to older African American women, we see that 24% live with their spouse, so that's less than older African American men. A sizable proportion, 30%, live with other relatives. Very few, 2%, live with non-relatives. And a significant proportion live by themselves as well. So this group of people who live by themselves, who live alone, this is of concern for us because of issues related to social isolation and social support, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Now that we have a general picture of the demographics of older African Americans, I'd like to move on and talk a little bit about the health status of older African Americans. So this graph here depicts three very common health conditions in the U.S. On the very left is blood pressure, in the middle is diabetes, and on the very right is stroke. And it's divided into race groups as well as age groups. So the red bars represent African Americans, the green bars represent whites. And at the very top of each of the three graphs are individuals 18 to 34. In the middle are people who are 35 to 49. and at the very bottom are older adults, age 50 to 64. So we're going to look specifically at the health trends of older adults. So looking at high blood pressure, at the bottom there, we see that 61% of older African Americans have high blood pressure, compared to 41% of whites, older whites. So there's disparities in the prevalence rate of high blood pressure. We see the same pattern with diabetes, with more older African Americans being diagnosed with diabetes than older whites, and the same with stroke. So overall, we see great disparities in many health conditions. And one thing to note is that this racial disparity, the disparity between African Americans and whites, is greatest at late life. So if you look at the top of each graph, the difference between the red bar and the green bar are minimal in early life, among 18 to 34 years old. We also see the same pattern when we're looking at early deaths due to all causes. So looking specifically again at older adults, we see that the red bar, which represents older African Americans, is higher than the green bar representing older whites. So older African Americans are more likely to die early than older whites due to all causes. Okay, I know this graph is a lot, and I'll walk you through it. So despite all of these racial disparities in health, there is some good news when we look at life expectancy. So historically, the life expectancy of African Americans have been lower than that of whites, and it is still the case today. However, this gap in life expectancy between African Americans and whites is closing. So take a look first at the life expectancy of whites versus black. So the blue bar at the top represents whites. The black bar at the bottom represents blacks. So this is data for life expectancy from 1999 through 2013. And it shows that life expectancy of blacks have increased over the past decade. But there is still a gap in life expectancy between African Americans, between blacks and whites. Although this gap is closing, it's gradual. We see the same when we look specifically at women. White women have higher life expectancy than black women, but black women are gaining in life expectancy as well, and the gap is narrowing. Same with men. Black men have a lower life expectancy than white men. Also note that the gender difference between black women and black men is greater than the gender difference between white women and white men. So what this data tells us is that overall, the life expectancy gap has narrowed, but it has been very gradual. Progress has been very gradual, not nearly as fast as we would like to see it. Ideal would be no gap at all. However, I don't think we can realize that. I don't think that this life expectancy gap can ever disappear if we don't address upstream factors that contribute to this gap. Factors such as economic equality, access to housing, access to health care, access to education, things of that nature. All those factors contribute to life expectancy inequalities. We saw in the data that African American men made the most gains in life expectancies over the past decade, with older African American men having an average life expectancy of 75 years in 1999 and that increasing to 78 years in 2013. So why is the life expectancy gap decreasing? That has a lot to do with deaths due to 4 different conditions. So this graph depicts deaths of older African Americans due to heart disease, which is the red line at the very top, cancer, the middle line, and stroke. So we see that from 1999 to 2015, there has been a reduction in deaths due to heart disease, to cancer, and stroke. What you don't see in this graph is deaths due to HIV. We've also seen a significant reduction in deaths among African Americans from HIV. So now that we know a little bit more about the health problems that older African Americans struggle with, let's take a look at who they turn to for help dealing with these and other problems. So in terms of informal health, professional and informal health seeking among older African Americans, we see that the majority, about half of all older African Americans, seek help from professional as well as informal helpers. Informal helpers being family, friends, neighbors, etc. Very few, only 4%, seek help exclusively from professional helpers. A sizable proportion, almost a third, seek help exclusively from informal sources. And then a significant number of older African Americans, 14%, seek no help at all, whether it's informal or professional. So what do we know about professional service use among older African Americans? Well, the research tells us that older African Americans are less likely to engage in professional services than younger African Americans, and compared to older whites. So there is an age disparity as well as a racial disparity in service use. Older African Americans are also more likely to seek mental health care from primary care physicians. So for mental health problems, older African Americans are more likely to see their family doctors than a mental health specialist. Although this is good in some ways because it means that older African Americans are receiving some form of help for their mental health problems, it's also concerning, or it's not ideal, because primary care physicians lack expertise in mental health problems. They lack expertise in assessing, in diagnosing, and in treating mental health problems. Older African Americans are also more likely to seek care at emergency rooms than outpatient services compared to older whites. This is very problematic because, for several reasons. The first is that this suggests that older African Americans may be waiting so long to seek help that their conditions have become so severe that they wind up in the emergency room. The other issue with this is that it's much costlier to receive emergency care than it is to receive outpatient care. And it can also be much more disruptive, especially if hospitalization is involved. So one of the reasons that we see this overall underutilization of services among older African Americans could be explained by barriers that older African Americans face when engaging professional services. For example, costs could be prohibitive. Insurance coverage, maybe the procedure, the service, or the specialist is not covered by the insurance, or coverage is not enough. There may be a lack of transportation, especially accessible transportation. to get to and from appointments. There may be a lack of services that are available or a lack of knowledge of how to access these services. It may be perceptions of the problem. So maybe this problem will go away on its own. I don't really need to get help. Or this is something that I need to deal with by myself. It could also be perception of the service or service provider. The service provider won't be able to help me with my problem. Communication style is also another major barrier to service use. For example, research has found that physicians are much more likely to use an authoritative communication style with African Americans than with whites. And this comes across as disrespectful and condescending. And another barrier, a major barrier, is discrimination. For example, an older African American may have engaged formal services in the past and have experienced discrimination. And we have to keep in mind that when a person engaged services, it's more than just the provider that they engage with, right? It starts from when they phone in for an appointment or walk into the clinic for an appointment to when they get there, and when they speak to the receptionist, to the nurse, etc. So there are lots of opportunities for discrimination to arise when an older person engages professional services. So if a person engaged services previously and experienced discrimination, they may be less likely to seek services in the future. So this next slide can demonstrate how this might arise. So in this slide, I'm going to show you the race of service providers for older African Americans and older whites. So the blue bars that you will see represents white providers, green bars represent black providers. So among older African Americans who seek help from psychiatrists, we see that most older African Americans seek help from white psychiatrists. For older whites, the same. Most older whites seek help from white psychiatrists. Same with other mental health professionals. Whites, it looks like whites seek help exclusively, help from white mental health specialists. The same for family doctor, although we see that there is a greater proportion of older African Americans who seek help from black doctors. Majority of older whites seek help from white family doctors. And when we look at clergy, we see something different. So with clergy, what we see here is that the majority of older African Americans see black clergy. In contrast, the majority of older whites see white clergy. So overall, we see that older whites are more likely to receive services from white providers, and it's the same for older African Americans. Older African Americans are more likely to receive services from older whites. What's so striking about this is that older whites have the privilege of being able to go to a provider of their own race, while older African Americans don't have that privilege. They are not able to go to providers of their own race. So what are the implications of this race discrepancy or this race discordance for older blacks? Well, there are implications for implicit bias. With this race discordance, there are a lot of opportunities for implicit bias to arise, and this could affect the therapeutic relationship. It can affect the type of care older African Americans receive, the quality of care, and treatment compliance. It can present as a barrier to communication, to effective communication between the client and the provider. It can also affect the client's reactions to and trust in the provider's recommendations. So again, this has implications for quality of care and treatment compliance. Now, I'd like to move on and look at some factors that influence the health of older African Americans. The first factor that I'd like to talk about is social isolation. Social isolation has been receiving a lot of attention from prominent organizations nationally as well as internationally. For example, the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare has named social isolation as one of its 12 grand challenges of social work. There's also been considerable attention paid to social isolation by the AARP as well as the World Health Organization. One of the reasons why social isolation has been receiving such increasingly urgent attention is because of the great public health threat that it presents. Social isolation can affect health in many ways. In fact, the effects of social isolation on health is so negative that being socially isolated is equivalent in terms of mortality risks as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Social isolation is also related to a number of other health conditions such as heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, etc. It is also linked to mental health problems. In my own research among African Americans, I found that social isolation is linked to depression, depressive symptoms, anxiety disorders, and psychological distress. So much of the discussion around social isolation has failed to distinguish between two components of social isolation that I'd like to introduce to you today. One is objective social isolation, and the other is subjective social isolation. So objective social isolation is a tangible and quantifiable lack of connections with other people. So that's having a smaller social circle, not being in touch or being in contact with your family and friends, things like that. In contrast, subjective isolation is the perceived lack of closeness between the person and members of their social network. So this has more to do with feelings. So feelings of being lonely, so loneliness, right? It's important to note that objective and subjective isolation are not mutually inclusive. What I mean by that is somebody could potentially be subjectively isolated, but not objectively isolated. So that would be equivalent to feeling alone in a crowd. Now, taking a look at social isolation among older African Americans, particularly isolation from family and friends, we see that for objective isolation, most older African Americans are not objectively isolated. There are a few, 6%, who are isolated from family. A little larger group who are isolated from friends, 11%. And 4% who are isolated from both. We see the same pattern when we look at subjective isolation, with 89% reporting that they are not subjectively isolated from either group, 2% isolated from family, 7% from friends, and 2% who are isolated from both family and friends. So overall what we see is that objective and subjective isolation is not very common among older African Americans. And among people who are isolated, they are more likely to be isolated from family. from friends than from family. We also see that there is a greater proportion of older African Americans who are objectively isolated rather than subjectively isolated. And this is important to note because the effects of objective and subjective isolation are different on health. They have different effects on health. And research has shown that subjective isolation, feeling lonely, or not feeling emotionally close to our network, that has a much greater effect on health than objective isolation, having fewer friends and family. So in my research, I've also found that the effects of isolation can be different for men and women. So when I looked at the effects of subjective isolation on high blood pressure among older African Americans, I found that for people who were not subjectively isolated from family or friends, men and women had the same probability of having high blood pressure. Men are represented by the green bar, women are represented by the orange bar. But when we look at those who were subjectively isolated from family and friends, we see that men have a much greater probability of having hypertension than women. So what this tells us is that older African American men are more vulnerable to the effects of subjective isolation than older African American women. I'd like to move on now to another factor that influences the health of older African Americans, and that's social support. Now, does anybody know what we as humans have in common with rhesus monkeys, African gray parrots, chimpanzees, and fruit flies? So we, and all these animals on the screen, are social animals. That means that we need social relationships, social contact, companionship in order to survive and thrive. Our relationships with others are so important because we derive social support from these relationships we have with others. And social support is important because it allows us to deal with problems and stressors that arise throughout our lives. In other words, social support is a stress coping resource for us. So for that reason, social support has been linked to depression. It can protect against depression, against anxiety, against distress, as well as against protect against other physical health disorders such as cardiovascular diseases. So a major source of social support for older African Americans are family members, especially extended family members. So looking right now at this graph, this is a graph of the frequency of contact that older African Americans have with their extended family. We see that at the very bottom, older African Americans, about 50% of older African Americans say that they are in touch with their extended family nearly every day. Another 28 say at least once a week, and 10% say a few times a month. That's roughly 90% who say that they have contact with their extended family a few times a month or more. We also see that the vast majority of older African Americans are very emotionally close to their extended family. 84% say that they are very close in terms of emotional closeness. Now, regarding the social support that older African Americans receive from their family, we see that almost half receive social support from family either fairly often or very often. So what this information tells us is that older African Americans are very well integrated into their family support networks. That family members are important and viable sources of social support for older African Americans. And providers really should keep in mind how they could possibly incorporate family members into the care of older African Americans, given the prominence of family members for older African Americans. Another major source of social support for older African Americans are church members. So, the Black church has historically played a prominent role in African American communities. It is often the center of social, civic, and political life in African American communities. Take, for example, the Civil Rights Movement. Many civil rights events were organized within the church by church members. Many civil rights activists were church members recruited from congregations. A number of prominent civil rights leaders were also leaders within their faith communities, such as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So as a result, the Black church, in addition to being a religious institution, it's also a social, civic, political, educational, and economic institution. Many Black churches offer a wide range of services and programs, such as material aid programs, educational programs, counseling and intervention services, programs for older adults and their caregivers. It's really important to note here that the significance of the Black church and many of these characteristics of the Black church really emerged in response to the systematic oppression and disenfranchisement that many Black communities were experiencing and are still experiencing at the societal, federal, state, and local levels. So, of course, naturally, religion and spirituality are very important for many older African Americans. So when we asked older African Americans, how important is religion in your life, and how important is spirituality in your life, we see that the vast majority say that spirituality is important, as well as religion is very important. Note that religion and spirituality very often goes hand in hand for older African Americans. You're not as likely to see an older African American person saying that they are spiritual but not religious. That is more common among older whites. In terms of religious service attendance, most older African Americans attend church regularly, with 23% saying they attend a few times a month, 45% at least once a week, and 8% nearly every day. So very high rates of service attendance in this population. So given the integration of older African Americans into their religious and faith communities, of course, church members are also important relationships for older African Americans. Looking specifically at frequency of contact, we see that many older African Americans report frequent contact with church members. They're also very close to church members. Looking at social support that older African Americans receive from church members, we see that many receive support either fairly often or very often. In addition to providing emotional support, which is making people feel loved and cared for, church members also provide instrumental support to older African Americans. Instrumental support is support that is tangible. Some of the most common types of instrumental support that we've found are financial assistance, help with chores, transportation, and help during illness. So it's clear that church members are an important part of older African Americans' support network. And these relationships with church members are so important because they can protect older African Americans from a range of mental and physical health problems, such as suicide, depression, anxiety, mortality, cancer, etc. Church relationships can also mitigate some of the harmful effects of stress on older African Americans. For example, in a recent study, I found, looking at discrimination, church relationships, and generalized anxiety disorder among older African Americans, I found that for people who were not in frequent contact with church members, as discrimination increased, so did the probability of having an anxiety disorder, having a generalized anxiety disorder. Now, if we look at those who were in frequent contact, who had high contact with church members, we see that discrimination had no effect on generalized anxiety disorder. This suggests that contact with church members can mitigate some of the harm that discrimination can do. We see the same when we look at emotional closeness. Among those with low emotional closeness, as discrimination increased, so did generalized anxiety disorder. However, among those with high emotional closeness to church member, discrimination was unrelated to generalized anxiety disorder. Again, suggesting that being emotionally close to church members can somehow provide coping resources that helps older adults deal with the stress of discrimination, therefore mitigating some of the harm of discrimination on health. Now, the last topic I'd like to talk about today is caregiving. Caregiving among African Americans. So, what the research tells us is that older African Americans are less likely to be institutionalized than older whites. So what this means is that older African Americans rely more heavily on informal sources of caregiving, such as caregiving from family members, right? Such as adult children and relatives. We also know from the research that the caregiver-recipient relationship among African Americans is diverse, meaning that even though the majority of caregivers for older African Americans are family, especially adult children, other relatives are involved as well as friends and neighbors and church members. We also know that African American caregivers have higher needs for professional support services, yet they are less likely to use these services. So utilization rates are lower, even though the need is greater. So what this tells us is that the needs of African American caregivers aren't being met, and that African American caregivers may be facing barriers to these services. Therefore, that's why we're seeing these low rates of service use despite high needs for these services. So many people derive benefits from caregiving, such as a greater sense of meaning from caregiving. However, caregiving also has its negative effects on caregivers. For example, caregivers are more likely to experience depression, burden, role strain. Role strain is the feeling that you're not able to fulfill all of the requirements of your role as a caregiver. And also psychological distress. These are some of the negative effects that caregiving has on African American caregivers. And it's important to note that social support can mitigate these effects. So caregivers who have a lot of support will be less likely to experience these negative effects of caregiving. So again, we see that social support is important and it plays such a prominent role. I'd like to conclude now by leaving you with a few take-home messages. The first is that the older adult population is becoming increasingly diverse. So this means that services also needs to be increasingly diverse in order to meet the needs of a diverse older population. Social support is critical for good health and well-being. So you've seen that we are social animals. Social relationships, social contact, and companionship is critical for us to survive and to thrive. And from those relationships, we derive social support. And social support is very important for promoting good health and well-being, as well as staving off the negative effects of stress, such as caregiving stress. Providers really should take into account the resources that clients have available to them or resources they may lack. We really shouldn't make assumptions about the resources that our clients have. For example, we've seen that religion and spirituality, faith is important for many older African Americans. So in assessments, providers really need to take into account faith, religion, and spirituality. However, there should be assumptions that since so many African Americans are religious and spiritual, that all older African Americans are religious and spiritual. And that's why assessments that include religion and faith is so important. And finally, assessments of social isolation should consider both objective and subjective isolation. Given that objective and subjective isolation have differing effects on health, it's important to understand whether older African Americans are experiencing one form of isolation or both, because they have different implications for health, but also the way that we would address subjective isolation is different from the way we would address objective isolation as well. And I think the ultimate take-home message here is that the older population is getting more and more diverse, and the needs of this diverse population is growing. So our services really need to be able to meet the needs of this diverse population. It needs to be culturally relevant and culturally competent, because the lack of culturally competent services can also be a barrier for many older African Americans and their caregivers to engage service. Thank you. Thank you.